There's an idea that's unfortunately very prevalent within gaming spaces, one that haunts every discussion about any game that isn't completely within the mainstream. This idea is that everything that doesn't fit within standard design conventions is simply bad, as nebulous and useless as a term that is when discussing art. Computer role-playing games, with their isometric perspectives and slow-paced, statistics-based dice rolling, are often disregarded entirely as a genre. A game like Pathologic's experimental usage of failure and difficulty exhibited through the struggles to attain medicine while also feeding the player character and making sure narrative goals are met by the end of each day is seen as simply an unplayable challenge. Even Tank Controls, a scheme of design that was once in one of the most mainstream series in gaming, Resident Evil, are maligned as too strict and restrictive. There is a resistance to ideas that don't slot in with the current mainstream idea of what a video game is. With most games that fit the descriptor of the truly non-conventional, these idiosyncrasies are either used to ignore it, or are waved aside as something to be looked over when the game is examined. A game such as Devil May Cry 2 is viewed as worthless despite its gameplay systems conveying a palpable sense of guilt and depression through how heavy and unsatisfying the combat is, or a game like Grim Fandango is cited as having outdated puzzle design to be utterly ignored for its other, admittedly wonderful, elements in spite of the puzzles being a major point of the game's comedy. These are the categories that most games deemed to have unfavorable gameplay fall under. But there is a third category, the idea of the game that's quote-unquote bad on purpose. The archetype of games that are bad on purpose has persisted throughout gaming critique for the past 2 decades, a discourse largely starting during the 6th generation of consoles. This is one of the ultimate dismissals of a game's ludic elements that exists, that they simply weren't considered in the first place. People will be quick to defend games like Takeshi's Challenge for being unconventional not by analyzing the strengths of its unique approach and decisions, but appealing to some construed authorial intent of it being bad. There is no game, aside arguably the aforementioned Pathologic due to its increased presence in online discourse over the past few years, that has suffered from the portrayal of bad on purpose more than Cavia's 2003 masterpiece Drag-On Dragoon, or as we know it in the West, Drakengard. Drakengard is most well known as the first game in the largely Yoko Taro-helmed series referred to colloquially as Drakengard, a portmanteau of the 2 names that make up the core canon of the series, Drakengard and Nier. Despite all 5 entries in the vast series being connected narratively and thematically, due to both unfortunate circumstance and a lack of most entries in the series being palatable to general gaming audiences, most people who know of the series have only played Nier Automata, and worse, largely know nothing of the games before it outside sets of empty references. Drakengard is largely understood as, to put it in brief terms, cool lore for Nier Automata, and, in rare cases, Nier as well. Drakengard and Drakengard 3, when viewed as experiences instead of simply context for other games, themselves are discussed as bad games that are bad on purpose. And Drakengard 2 is just disregarded for being a bad game that was bad on accident because the auteur they fetishize wasn't behind the director's wheel on that one. Drakengard's gameplay is entirely written off from having any potential merit, a product of the perception of Yoko Taro as a mythologized trickster who solely designs games to have a laugh. However, though Drakengard is an abrasive work, it's not a bad one. The opposite. Drakengard is a masterpiece of video play. Drakengard's main gameplay loop consists of ground combat where the player controls the main character, Caim. Largely inspired by the 3rd entry in the Dynasty Warriors series, combat is constructed out of one simple combo string and one aerial attack that kills large waves of enemies quickly. The challenge residing more in the attrition of managing your HP over the course of long battles and the strategy of which units to go for, what areas to explore, and the allotted time limit you have outside of the target units as opposed to individual enemies having challenging movesets to plan around as might be seen in some of Drakengard's contemporaries such as the first Devil May Cry. Under these terms, Drakengard is really not that much different than Dynasty Warriors 3, the biggest changes being a larger variety of enemy types, including ones that can counter the super move that both games hold as a way of clearing out the screen quickly after you've filled up a gauge with the regular attacks. The dragon and the ground combat sections having a much larger range of motion than the horse, with attacks that inherently have the same properties and strength as the super moves, and a total lack of allied units on the field to assist the player. The Dynasty Warriors style gameplay, which will be referred to with the accepted terminology Muso from here on, lends the game a hypnagogic trance-like quality. The massive violence of Muso is easily forgotten when the ludic systems are so repetitious and relaxing. While Dynasty Warriors makes no attempt to comment on this juxtaposition, it is a core fragment of Drakengard's narrative identity. The game ends up creating a ludic meditation on violence itself through these gameplay systems in conjunction with narratives such as Caim's endless misguided revenge quest fueled by an increasingly distorted memory of his dead parents, the dragon Angelus' utter contempt for all of the people who travel with her only overturned in the 11th hour, Caim's sister Furiae's violence against the self in both her resignation of her humanity to become a religious idol and her suicide in one of the game's routes, Caim's best friend and Furiae's former lover Inoart's ventures to totally possess Furiae and remove her personhood even more than her role as a goddess already has, the priest Verdelay's hand in turning Furiae into the religious symbol that she has become, and even the priestess Manah's suffering as she was only child when she was kidnapped and indoctrinated for the purpose of hosting the Eldritch Watchers from beyond the veil. Even the optional party members contribute to this. Leonard's horrific abuse of his family members that is so revolting I won't go into detail here, Alyosha's cannibalism, and Cire's subtler violence through his lack of conviction to end abuse when it appears, rather choosing eternal stalemate as seen in the game's fourth ending wherein he freezes time forever, then accept that all things, even worlds, must end. That ending, the one that leaves the world an empty frozen husk, also contributes to these ideas through how it's acquired in the gameplay. To get this ending, more violence and bloodshed must be committed on the player's part due to more missions being required to attain it. The more bloodshed, the worse off the world is at the end. The game's final ending culminating in an empty, meaningless death for Caim and Angelus in modern-day Tokyo, shot down as casualties by the Air Force. The game's aesthetic elements also contribute to this harmony, the UI elements full of warnings every time you save, and existential theological elements, ancient drawings of angels reminding you of ideas both constructed by man yet incomprehensible to it. There's a kill counter in the bottom right corner of the screen. While the level of violence would normally be forgotten, each kill gains a peck from a bird above the counter, methodically counting each individual murder. Every 10 earns an angel by the counter, mimicking the spirit of your victim ascending into heaven and dissipating, always bringing your attention back to the atrocities done by your hand. The music is jarring, much like everything else, a menagerie of samples repeated violently against the listener's ear, intense and panic-inducing percussion punctuating the discordant and jagged melodies. Even one of the sound effects feels as if it's trying to escape the game's soundscapes and puncture the player, a loud rupture shouting out of the speakers every time the super move is used in the game's Panzer Dragoon / Ace Combat-inspired flight sections. Drakengard's marriage of all the elements of a video game, writing, aesthetics, and loot is nearly unparalleled within the medium, hardly bad on purpose, yet it's still written off as such. And that is the crux of the issue. Drakengard makes the player uncomfortable, afraid, hurt, and depressed. It invokes despair through all of its elements, and its gameplay uses its trance-like rhythmic state to further that. However, since the gameplay isn't consistently challenging like, say, FromSoft's Ovra, and it doesn't fulfill the power fantasy of more stylish action games such as Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, then at worst it is disregarded as a bad game unworthy of discussion, and at best considered bad on purpose, because ludic experiences must be restricted to what average gamers are familiar with and makes them feel good about themselves. This is, in part, why the flight sections are generally considered the good parts of the game, in spite of also following the same ideas the rest of the game does. The dragon flight stages are still abrasive in their presentation, still carry the harrowing, hopeless writing, performances of anguish permeating the soundscapes along harsh violin notes. But the gameplay is more in step with other rail shooters, much more normative than the burgeoning Muso format, which never caught on a ton outside of licensed tie-in games featuring characters from other game franchises like The Legend of Zelda or from anime such as One Piece. On the contrary, rail shooters were not only established, but were a legacy genre genre on their way out in the console scene, Panzer Dragoon Orta and Res being the only other notable releases in the space contemporary to Drakengard. This has narrative implications as well, the old, undying dragon represented by the older genre, while the youthful human is a more novel yet doomed gameplay system, but that discussion is not the focus of this particular piece. What is, however, is that Drakengard's aerial combat is nearly identical to Panzer Dragoon's, simply not on rails. Angelus can fly freely around the space as the player shoots her fireballs and locks onto targets to release a volley of them. Enough attacks and, similar to ground combat, you're given access to a super move that clears out all the targets on the screen. All of these mechanics, free-flying aside, are present in Panzer Dragoon, which itself is building on other games in the genre. While I won't argue that Panzer Dragoon was mainstream then, and it certainly isn't now, its gameplay structures are not at all unfamiliar to mainstream pieces of one console generation before Drakengard. Star Fox 64 is similarly a rail shooter, only with more free-flying sections, a variety of control schemes through how the ship transforms, and a lack of the same satisfying lock-on system that defines Panzer Dragoon and that Drakengard employs to lesser effect than its Dragon Riding Senior. Rail shooters were and are far more established as an acceptable type of gameplay, and thus these sections in Drakengard are received much more favorably by the average gamer, seen as the parts the team quote-unquote got right. Drakengard is an incredible experience, a conjunction of all aspects of a video game to create something seldom seen within or even outside the medium. It's an abrasive, painful, subversive, transgressive masterclass in the bleak and macabre, a harrowing condemnation of violence both personal and systemic, and simply one of the greatest works of fiction I've ever engaged with. Everything in the series afterward, while sometimes incredible in its own right, lives in the shadow of what Cavia accomplished in 2003. It's not bad, not even on purpose. It's beautiful. This has been Arcade Everlasting, whose passion for the medium has been reignited. Signing off. Thank you for watching.